Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon. Welcome to the third and final event in our three-part series, Writing the Path, Securing Global COVID-19 Vaccine Equity. My name is Basola Jakutu, and I'm an infectious disease specialist at Brigham and Women's and Massachusetts General Hospitals in Boston, Massachusetts, which is where I'm currently located. I'm also an associate director within the Harvard University Center for AIDS Research, otherwise known as the CFAR. The CFAR has partnered with the Harvard Global Health Institute and Ariadne Labs on this series to elevate the importance of equitable global vaccine allocation and distribution. Our aim is to foster dialogue between global experts about the challenges and paths to securing global COVID-19 vaccine equity. In the last sessions, we looked at the bottlenecks to equitable vaccine distribution, including scarcity and vaccine confidence. Today, in this final webinar, Reimagining Pandemic Preparedness, Making Equity a Strategic Priority, we're going to be thinking upstream about ways we can learn from the global governance failures of this pandemic to better prepare to make equity a global priority in future health crises. Before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping notes. First, this session is being streamed and recorded through Zoom and will be made available on the HGHI website. Secondly, we'll be running a live Q&A towards the end of the panel discussion. So we've enabled our Ask a Question feature on the bottom of your screen. Please put questions there and we'll do our best to answer them during the Q&A. Thirdly, we've also enabled the chat function, which will be monitored by my colleague Luke. And lastly, to get started, we would love to see everyone post in the chat now where you are today, including your city and country. With that, allow me to introduce our speakers. Dr. Fiona Adehebwe is a vaccinologist, an immunization expert, and a sexual and reproductive health specialist with extensive experience with project management in international public health. She is currently the Regional New Vaccines Introduction Medical Officer at the World Health Organization Regional Office for Africa in Brazzaville, Congo, where she coordinates WHO's work in the Africa region to introduce and increase the uptake of new and underutilized vaccines. Fiona is currently coordinating the WHO Africa COVID-19 Vaccine Readiness and Equitable Delivery Task Force, which is leading the rollout of COVID-19 vaccines in Africa. Fiona is also a survivor of severe COVID-19, and thus is an outspoken advocate for the value of vaccination as a critical tool for ending the COVID-19 pandemic. Our second panelist is Preeti Krishtel, a health justice lawyer and co-founder of IMAC, a nonprofit established to build a more just and equitable medicine system. She has spent nearly 2 decades exposing structural inequities affecting access to medicines and vaccines across the global South and in the US. That includes advocating for equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines across the globe and ensuring that the Biden-Harris administration is prioritizing equity in the Patent and Trademark Office. IMAC's work on the patent system has been cited repeatedly in congressional testimony on prescription drug costs, most recently in hearings by the House Committee on Oversight and Reform. Our last panelist is Rohit Malpani, a public health consultant and advocate who represents non-governmental organizations on the board of Unitaid through Health Action International. Previously, he was Director of Policy and Analysis at the Médecins Sans Frontières Access Campaign. He was also a special advisor to Oxfam and a human rights advisor to the World Health Organization. Rohit is a lawyer by training and received a JD at the New York University School of Law. And lastly, our moderator and my former colleague, Dr. Celine Gounder, is the CEO, president, and founder of Just Human Productions, a nonprofit multimedia organization. She's also the host and producer of American Diagnosis, a podcast on health and social justice, and Epidemic, a podcast about the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Gounder is a CNN medical analyst, and prior to that, she was a frequent guest expert on CBS, MSNBC, CNBC, HLN, BBC, Al Jazeera America, MTV, Dr. Oz, and Oprah Prime. She's written for countless media outlets and is best known for her coverage of the Ebola, Zika, COVID-19, opioid, and gun violence epidemics. Dr. Gounder is also an infectious disease specialist at New York University School of Medicine and provides clinical care at Bellevue Hospital Center. In addition to her many accomplishments, Celine also recently served on the COVID-19 advisory board for the Biden-Harris transition team. With that, I'll hand it over to Celine, who will be moderating the discussion today.
Thanks so much for the very kind welcome, Bisola. And we'll start off with our first speaker, Phoebe Ajahibwe, if you'd like to share your slides with us.
Thank you very much. And really want to thank you for this opportunity to discuss the topic of vaccine equity. And I want to give you quickly to show you what the picture looks like, because from a different level, people who sit at different levels see things really differently. Well, we know that Africa, we say we've made some significant progress towards vaccination in the last 2 months, but actually the equity gap is very, very real. When you look at the map on the left, the darker the green color, the more doses that have been administered per 100 population. But when you look at the African map, we have the lightest green color, but we also have the white color. We have 14 economies globally that have not yet started vaccination, and 7 of these lie in Africa. And when you look at on the right, you'll see that we have so far administered just 17.9 million doses, a continent of 1.3 billion people, and against what the world has administered at 1.04 billion doses. We have just 1.3 people per 100 people that have been vaccinated so far in Africa, the doses that have been administered. This graph shows how high-income countries have progressed in the administration. The ratio between high-income countries' doses administered per inhabitant in comparison to the lowest-income countries. In February, high-income countries had administered 10,000 times of doses than the African countries, and the lower-income countries. Here, the lower-income countries, now we include Southeastern Asia and other low-income countries. You realize that when we bunch low-income countries together, now we have just 0.4 doses administered per 100 people. But that also means we have less than 1 dose per 50 people. It shows you how badly we are doing. But also right now in April, we have had the higher income countries have given 90 times more doses than the low-income countries. We know that most of the African countries and low-income countries were highly dependent on AstraZeneca doses that were manufactured in India, Serum Institute of India. But because of what is going on in India now with the recent epidemiology and the country really in a crisis, India has stopped the export of vaccines. This started in March. So we have had just 7 countries receiving a backlog of vaccines that were received from Serum Institute of India in April. And then now that was in March, and now in April, we have had only a few countries receive the doses. Still, this was a backlog from the doses that were meant to be shipped in February and March. But in May, we just got to learn that because India has made a decision to vaccinate all the 18 years and above, which is really understandable, we highly understand and quite empathetic, India is unable to provide the AstraZeneca manufactured from Serum Institute of India, which is manufacturing 3/4 of all the doses of AstraZeneca, which is what we are able to use in Africa. This graph just shows the vaccines that have been received, full immunization, 2 doses per 100 people. As you can see, only one country, Seychelles, has administered vaccine for over 50% of their population. And this is because this is quite a very tiny island in the Indian Ocean. But the other countries, we have less than 1 dose per 100 population. Really, this shows how much we are seeing on the African continent. We do have a lot of hesitancy that is not only in Africa, but in most low-income countries. And this stems mainly from the safety concerns, the safety rumors, and of course the mostly misinformation from the global north, not originating in Africa, but from the global north. But we also have issues with the handling of vaccine. Previously, when we receive new vaccines in any country, we do get a vaccine introduction grant. Most of the African countries being very poor, are Gavi eligible, and Gavi does provide us vaccine introduction grants and most of the funding for the vaccines. Most of the countries cannot afford the vaccines, neither can we afford the implementation, the operation of funds to roll out these vaccines. So really on the African continent, not only is there a problem with now access to the vaccine, we asked countries to roll out as much vaccine as possible to reach at least everybody with a single dose as we waited for the second dose. But now we are told we are unable to get the second dose from our biggest contributor to these vaccines. Again, we are back to appealing to richer countries that have excess doses to share the doses that they have. I'll stop here and over to you.
Thank you so much, Fiona. And next, we're going to turn it over to Preeti. I don't think you have any slides, Preeti, is that right?
I don't. I thought I'd just start by providing some background context on the conversation that's currently happening, the effort that's being led by South Africa, India, and 100 countries to ask for a temporary waiver on intellectual property at the World Trade Organization. In October, the request for the waiver was made, and in December, that's when we saw the mRNA vaccines, Moderna and Pfizer, get approved and go onto the market. It's now been 4 months since the vaccines made it onto the market. And while most of the world is in agreement that we do need a waiver, a temporary waiver of intellectual property in order to expedite the transfer of knowledge to manufacturers across the global South so that we can scale up as much manufacturing as possible, certain countries, including my own, the United States, are the lone holdouts. And so what I thought that I would do today is just touch on some of the counter arguments that we're hearing to why the waiver has not been endorsed yet. Those arguments include the fact that there are concerns that manufacturers in the global South do not have capacity or the knowledge to produce these vaccines. We are hearing that there are safety concerns. What will happen if Pfizer and Moderna are not in control of everything? We are hearing that maybe it will be more efficient if the United States were to produce vaccines for the whole world and then export them. And undergirding all of these arguments is a very narrow, in my opinion, vision of the world that completely ignores the 3 decades of experience we have with manufacturers across the global South, including in India, producing medicines and vaccines every time that they're told that they don't have the capacity and that it's actually impossible to achieve this goal. So right now, the Biden administration here in the US still has not committed in concrete terms to supporting the IP waiver that's being requested by over 100 countries. They have not committed, although they have signaled that they are more open to sharing know-how and technology with manufacturers in other countries. And there are other barriers, including investment barriers, that have not been publicly endorsed yet as well. So what I wanted to do with my few minutes today is take a step back from this current very politicized debate and tell you a little bit about the intellectual property system itself from a racial and gender equity lens, because I think it provides some context to help understanding why in this moment, when we are in the worst global pandemic that we've seen in a century, we are relying on the intellectual property system and the way our pharmaceuticals market is organized to get us through, and why I don't think that will be successful. That is why we need extraordinary measures to look beyond this system. So just zooming out from the COVID vaccine equity issue, when you think about the IP system, and I'm going to use the US as an example because this specific issue of the mRNA vaccines that we're talking about, how do we unlock the manufacturing capacity of the world? It's become very contentious here in the United States because Moderna was almost 100% taxpayer funded. We advanced $1 billion for the R&D with taxpayer money for this vaccine, for the platform, and then another $1.5 billion in advance purchase commitments. And so you're talking about a situation where we have completely socialized the risk and privatized the profit. Today, the CEO of Moderna has made $4 billion already off of this vaccine. And in the coming years, one Wall Street analyst has said that Moderna is poised to make $100 billion off of this. And so we're in a moment where that's why we're calling on governments instead of the private market to deal with this problem, because the company does not have incentive to unlock global manufacturing capacity. So zooming out to just look at the intellectual property system itself. These are a few facts I don't think people understand about the IP system in America. Today, research has shown over the last 30 years that in America, less than 1% of patent holders are Black. The leading economists in our country, and this is undisputed, say that it is going to take 118 years to achieve gender equity in our patent system. They don't offer a comparable number of years for how long it is going to take to achieve that kind of equity for people of color. So it's a very, very imbalanced system at the current moment. In terms of the leadership of the Patent and Trademark Office in our nation's history, every single director has been a white male, except for one under President Obama. And we are eagerly waiting right now to see what decision President Biden is going to make on who he appoints. And whether that person is not only a woman, is not only a person of color, but is it most importantly going to be someone who is independent of the influence of the pharmaceutical or the technology industry. I have about a minute left. I will just say that these issues are not limited to people of color or to women. We have a lot of issues with the patent system in the United States as well in relation to indigenous communities worldwide. Currently, we're seeing, for example, a bioprospecting craze. The United States is one of the only countries in the world who has not officially signed on to the Convention on Biological Diversity or the Nagoya Protocol. And there's a booming market right now of psychedelics where companies, including and driven by American companies, are having a free-for-all with traditional knowledge from other countries without legally being required to get consent from or pay fair compensation to those communities as they get their patents and as they use that intellectual property to incentivize investment. So we have a system already for intellectual property writ large in the United States that is deeply structurally inequitable. And this is the system we are relying on now because there are not special market rules in the middle of a pandemic to step in and govern and override these traditional structures. This is the system we are operating in right now when we're having to make incredibly important decisions about who actually owns these vaccines and who has the power to make the decisions about unlocking global manufacturing capacity. And I would advocate very strongly that if we are serious about equity, the power should not lie with a handful of private companies whose incentives are all driven by the market and generating revenue. The decision should be put back in the hands of governments to make these calls and to unleash the full manufacturing potential of the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Preeti. So we've heard from Fiona Atuhibwe about the inequities in vaccine rollout and distribution, from Preeti Krishtel about the inequities in the patent system and between the public and private sector. Next, we'll be hearing from Rohit Malpani. Rohit?
Thanks a lot for having me join the panel discussion. First, I think we should acknowledge that more than a year into the pandemic, many of the systems that we have designed for just this moment, surveillance systems, contact tracing systems, even our political systems haven't functioned as they were supposed to. But our pharmaceutical system, and one that, as Preeti is noting, is based largely on intellectual property, is working exactly as it is intended to, or how it's been designed. This was a broken system when we entered the pandemic, and it's likely to remain a broken system when we exit. But collectively, we've long tolerated this system as good enough. It's a pharmaceutical system that's always rationed access to low and middle income countries, whether we mean access to scientific resources, financial resources, or end products. For example, 2 million people die every year of tuberculosis, almost all of them in low middle income countries. We haven't had a new vaccine for a century, and the sort of preferred drug treatments are expensive, they're lengthy, and they're not effective. But all of this, at least to the general public, is mostly invisible. So the difference with the COVID pandemic is it's making us question the pharmaceutical system, or at least how we all behave within it, because the inequity is too obvious to ignore, or just, perhaps too easy to describe. And that's sort of shown in the maps we saw in Fiona's presentation. But again, the system is performing exactly as it's intended to, in 4 ways. First, the public investment of funds, so over $100 billion, and publicly funded technology, for instance, like the Moderna-based technologies, have been privatized with no benefit or rights back to the public sector and public interest. Second, all of the products have been claimed by a narrow set of high-income countries and wealthy populations, while everyone else has to wait at the back of the line. Third, drug companies are earning outsized profits and will continue to do so. Preeti mentioned Moderna. Pfizer is expecting to earn at least $30 billion in revenue just this year. And fourth, when everything falls apart, as it is now, we scramble to put in place, inadequate voluntary measures to compensate for our failures and create sort of a charitable equilibrium. So, the problem with global governance is not that it's created this failure, but the people at the controls have never really believed that we would end up in this place based on the system we have. And in some respects, their decisions have made this worse. So global health agencies, in my experience, have not been transparent. Drug companies are feted as equal partners and even saviors instead of arm's length entities that have a different set of interests. And too much trust was placed in the main government funders of research and development, the US and the European Union, who ultimately were more focused on securing their own supplies and needs instead of pushing for worldwide sharing of knowledge and mass production. And we're hearing a lot of rhetoric today that we want to fix what's going wrong and to make things better. But in just the last week, the European Union has booked an additional 2 billion doses of vaccines for the next 2 years. And the UK has just reserved an additional 60 million doses for this year to provide its population with a third dose, even as most people will not have had their first. Now, the failure in global governance, I think, just to take a step back, is also built on many bad decisions from the last 2 decades and the lessons we learned and then unlearned from the AIDS pandemic. So in the early part of the century, there was a momentum to accountability, red lines that neither governments nor companies could cross, and a sense that overcoming AIDS in a fair and equitable manner was to be determined by all governments collectively and by those living or at high risk of HIV. Yet the sense that, we would never again have this happen I think waned away, and we forgot what produced success, and we've moved to an approach to HIV that's based on voluntarism, on philanthropy, and on the drug industry's partners in the response. And this win-win approach worked because there was no real pain or trade-off for the winners, especially drug companies in wealthy countries. So drug companies got their profits, wealthy countries could provide support and improve their standing, and low and middle income countries got access to low-cost medicines on terms set by drug companies. But win-win solutions only work when those with power do not have their power or profits challenged, and when the disease itself only affects people living elsewhere. If the more powerful side has to make a sacrifice or may lose something, the win-win solution becomes a win-lose free-for-all. And we all end up with the situation that we have. And finally, the last thing to say is the one major difference between the early response and today is the role of the Gates Foundation. The Gates Foundation designed much of the international response to the pandemic. It championed drug companies as partners and saviors. It refused to acknowledge intellectual property rights as a barrier to access and placed a large bet on what are called capacity reservations and advanced purchase commitments, both of which are not working. Whether you look at the distribution of diagnostics, of monoclonal antibodies, and of course of vaccines. Just right now, Bill Gates is actively speaking out against the TRIPS waiver, which Preeti was talking about, even though 100 governments, members of Congress, former heads of states, and Nobel Prize winners are all supporting it. To state the obvious, the whole purpose of the Gates Foundation, and of course of any philanthropy, is to make the current system work, no matter how badly it's performing. And personally, it's good that the Gates Foundation was not involved in the early AIDS response. What would have happened if, like Bill Gates is stating today with respect to vaccines, and much as drug companies did in 2000, that companies and public producers in the global South were not capable of producing AIDS medicines without grants, assistance, and permission from the drug industry. how much more of a catastrophe would we have had? And so, in closing, we have a choice. Either we have an approach to pandemic preparedness that is based on a messy but collective will of governments and societies based on what works, or we allow a single individual leading an unaccountable and unelected foundation to make these decisions on behalf of everyone. We can't have both. We also have to be honest about whether we can continue to have a system that works for so few and is broken for so many. And if we continue to tolerate it this way, at least we know we are doing so with our eyes wide open. Thanks.
Thank you, Rohit. In your comments, you paint a picture of, frankly, neo-colonialism, where the old model may have been, for example, or older model may have been mining on federal lands, public resources being mined for private profit, and then leaving behind polluted water and air and land, and leaving that for the public really to clean up and deal with. So there's some real parallels here. In her opening comments, again, Fiona talked to us about the disparities in vaccination rates around the world. And this week, the US government announced its plans to share its AstraZeneca vaccine supply with the world. That's 60 million doses by June. Is this enough for high-income countries to be donating their excess vaccine to the global vaccination effort? Perhaps if we could start with Fiona.
Yeah, thanks again, Celine. So we know that, I don't know if anybody can imagine how devastating it would be, it looks or it is for somebody in a low-income country, health worker who is even working in a COVID-19 treatment center, dealing with patients directly, unable to access a first dose, whereas somebody in a high-income country that has no risk, has very low risk, everyone is at a certain risk level, has very low risk of severe disease, is getting their second dose or even planning to have their booster dose if the third dose is available. So Africa just needs, the COVAX facility planned to deliver 600 million doses just to Africa. And this was to cover just 20% of the population, which is our highest risk population, the priority groups. We now will not be able to get these doses if we continue at this rate. So should richer countries really be thinking of giving Africa what they have in excess? Or should we get back to a moral level and ethical level and say, since this is a global pandemic, we see what is happening in India right now is very obvious that this is an issue of the whole world. India closes and lower income countries cannot access these vaccines. Now, what will happen when low-income countries all get swamped with the variants, and we are still crossing over to higher income countries, or higher income countries are still coming to low-income countries for reasons that we all know? We still spread the pandemic and actually get to an extent where we are now dealing with variants instead of dealing with an issue where we could have vaccinated equally or equitably across the globe and been able to lower the rate at which these variants are going out of control, anyway, in short, no, it's not enough that you're giving us excess doses. It would be fairer if we are given doses to share equitably at a global level. The more doses we get, yes, globally, the more doses everybody gets at the same rate. Over.
Preeti and Rohit, I don't know about you, but I have family in India. So watching what's happening in India right now is really quite frightening. And if you look at 60 million doses from AstraZeneca, even if all of that went to India, that's only enough to vaccinate 2% of their population. So clearly not enough. It seems to me we have this false scarcity, manufactured scarcity in vaccine. What can we do to address that? Maybe Preeti first.
Sure. I think this absolutely is a false scarcity, as you say. I think the message coming out of the White House, even under this administration starting in January, has been that we have to vaccinate Americans first before we can think about sending these excess doses elsewhere. And it's just a false frame. It's a faulty framework. There was no reason starting in January after those vaccine approvals came through that we couldn't have started sharing IP, sharing know-how, transferring the technology, all of which is just fancy legal speak for saying working in a collaborative way with manufacturers that have a track record of producing vaccines in the global south. I think India has shown us time and time again, like with hepatitis, the hepatitis B vaccine is a really good example of this, that oftentimes when manufacturers in the West do say that manufacturers in the emerging markets do not have capacity, they're not only able to show that they're able to deliver quite quickly on bringing those vaccines to different countries in the world, but also to bring the cost down significantly. And I think that's the real issue here, is that this has the potential to be a very lucrative market for a lot of people already and is poised to grow even more. And so relinquishing that control in this moment, we haven't figured out how to incentivize that behavior yet.
Rohit, we've been talking about the TRIPS waiver. Is that enough really to scale up manufacturing? What are some of the other hurdles that we need to clear in order to really scale up supply so that we don't have this really false scarcity of vaccine?
Yeah, I think, with the TRIPS waiver, as I think a lot of us have said, it is necessary for scaling up any technology. For some technologies, it may not be sufficient. But even the sufficiency argument is really a short-term one. And we are looking at a pandemic that is going to require a long-term response. It's how we talk about it in the United States, where we're talking about this as sort of a flu type response over the long term. And so I think for me, the sufficiency argument melts away because over time, many other countries and many other producers have the capacity to develop the most sophisticated or complex vaccines through their own production processes. We're already seeing this, for example, in India and China, and we know the WHO, for example, is developing its own center of excellence for decentralizing mRNA production. So what we do need is we need the financing to make sure that the right investments can be made. It would be preferable to have a sharing of the know-how and some of the technology. But if pharmaceutical companies aren't willing to do that, the other companies will figure this out. This idea that they are unable to do this, that it's too complex, is false. It has occurred in the past, it's already occurring in the present, and it will occur in the future. And quite frankly, this idea that they can't do it without the support of certain companies or foundations or governments almost borders into racism, because it sort of implies that some set of countries and people are unable to do this. So it's preferable, it would be faster. We should have started doing this, as Preeti says, last year. As these vaccines were being developed, we could have done this in concert collectively and gotten out of this scarcity rationale, but we haven't done that. So we need to push forward with the things that we can do and then keep moving in the right direction.
Fiona, I recently spoke to your colleague, John Nkengasong, about what the Africa CDC is doing in collaboration with others on the continent to increase manufacturing capacity. There already are a number of sites throughout Africa, some of the Pasteur Institutes, for example, on the continent that are able to already manufacture vaccine. What is being done to scale up that capacity with an eye to building greater resilience to future pandemics as well?
Yeah, thank you. So just about 2 weeks ago, we had this Africa discussion, a conference with heads of states. These commitments have been made in the past for heads of for different countries to come together, pool resources to increase the manufacturing capacity in Africa. 99% of vaccines that we use in Africa are all imported. Just 1%, which is the yellow fever vaccine, is what we make here. So the capacity to, if we have the global north and able to have capacity to manufacture vaccines enough to even cover the global north itself or the European Union, how possible would it be for Africa, for example, in the current pandemic, to be able to manufacture COVID, to set up the manufacturing capacity for starters, and then be able to cover this. Definitely for COVID-19 vaccine, that is water under the bridge. But the discussions have started. We have learned from this pandemic that Africa needs its own manufacturing capacity. We can't go on like this. Otherwise, it's impossible. We do understand that the higher income countries have invested a lot and need to vaccinate their own people first. And yes, we come second or even last, but we do have to start this. So the discussions have commenced. We hope to have 5 hubs in the region, but the financial muscle is what we are looking for. The companies that were there were saying, yes, we are happy to do that. We know when the time comes, things usually turn out different, but we are really optimistic. But when it comes to the hands and technical know-how, we know that the training wouldn't take long. We do have the brains in Africa that can do this. What we don't have now is the financial capacity, but we are committed to do this. The pandemic has shown that we really need to do this manufacturing on our own.
I've been very happy to see that the new administration is rejoining many of the multilateral efforts, whether that's rejoining the WHO, becoming a partner in COVAX and donating funds. But Preeti, is donating funds to COVAX and joining WHO, is that enough for a country like the United States? What more do we need to be doing? And what are some of potentially the policy tools at our disposal to accomplish that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that the primary reason that advocates in this space were saying from day one of this pandemic that COVAX wasn't going to work was not because we did not want to be optimistic about global collaboration. I think we have always shown that we are willing to support, endorse things that we think are actually going to work. But COVAX itself was predicated on a market-based mechanism rooted in intellectual property rights. And what we have seen in our experience over the last 30 years is that these market-based mechanisms for health, and particularly for medicines and vaccines, they just don't work. And so at this point, the Biden administration, it's good that they are still trying to support these international endeavors. But I think that the way I think about this is that the United States went through a pretty fundamental racial awakening last year domestically. There was, we jokingly call it in my house the Great Awakening, because there is this sort of awakening into this understanding of how deeply rooted our colonized mindset is when it comes to our systems and structures. And so it's really baffling to me, though, how that understanding is so predominantly domestic. As Americans, we have such a narrow worldview. It's really just astounding. And so while so many of us are deeply trying to work through these layers of the systems we participate in, are complicit in, the ways in which, we make money, have opportunity, and the ways in which that does not happen in the same way for all of our citizens here, we haven't yet made that shift to understand that those lenses are necessary to viewing how we interact with the world at a global level. And so I think that's the first, it's almost a cultural or a lens shift that needs to happen for the administration to think about policy. I was reading in the New York Times, for example, that on Sunday, Prime Minister Narendra Modi from India had a phone call with President Biden, where he asked, can you waive that intellectual property so I can get my suppliers to move? And the president was non-committal. And every interaction that our movement has had with the White House, we're hearing things like, oh, but it wouldn't be safe to allow other manufacturers to proceed. There would be safety issues. They don't have capacity. The latest from this morning, the argument centers around the idea that it might just be better if we did all of the supply and exported it everywhere, as Fiona was referencing. And it's just, we haven't applied these same lenses of equity. And I think the first step is to get recognition from the administration that the new executive order that we have here in this country, that racial equity and equity generally are to be embedded across the operations, all of the government's operations. That understanding has to be global and not just domestic.
Just one last question before we turn to our Q&A. So I hope folks are dropping their thoughts in the chat. Rohit, how could our global system for vaccine research, development, manufacturing, how could we use this as an opportunity to quote the Biden campaign slogan, build back better, to reinvent? What kind of governance structure do we need to allow for equitable access to vaccines in the next pandemic? And what would a pandemic treaty for the world look like?
Oh, no, that's the question. No, so I think there's some ways of looking backwards and looking forward. So very quickly look backwards. After the Ebola pandemic or outbreak in 2014, there was an effort to create something known as the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, or CEPI. And the idea behind that essentially was in recognition that a couple of vaccines that have proven to be highly effective in preventing transmission of Ebola were essentially on the shelf and hadn't even sort of been tested in phase 1 trials, could have been brought forward and deployed very quickly into that outbreak. And so efforts were made to actually create and stand up this facility that is now playing a role in the COVID pandemic today. And a decision was taken very early on there, essentially to allow drug companies to negotiate exactly what the terms and conditions would be. I was involved in setting this up as a part of Médecins Sans Frontières. And I was shocked to be sitting in negotiations with the president of GSK Vaccines, Monsef Slaoui, the vice president of Takeda, and others who had a financial self-interest in ensuring that CEPI could not act in a manner that was not sort of designed to meet their interests. And we are paying for the cost of that. So my first response is it's a process argument. Either you say that we have one set of rules that governments are going to set up and that are going to work in a public health fashion, and companies have a different set of interests in which you have to have friction in negotiation, or you're just going to do what companies benefit from. So in looking forward, we have to be messy. We have to have agreement amongst all countries in a way that in which not everyone gets the way they want, but in which you are ensuring that you're putting the interests of all people more broadly first, and you're putting the interests of companies second. You have to be much more transparent. You have to ensure that intellectual property is not a barrier. And you have to ensure that you're creating a financing system that actually ensures that all of the capacity that needs to be built and all of the needs that have to be met can actually be taken forward in an easy way. I mean, I guess the short answer is this shouldn't be difficult. The politics is difficult, the interests are difficult. And often what I find is the hardest is we're at a moment right now in which everyone knows where we want to get. We all agree that we want to see everyone get immunized, that we all want to sort of get to this point. That's exactly when things are its most dangerous, when everyone speaks the same language, but everyone really means something very different. The drug industry says exactly what we are saying often. We want to see the whole world get immunized, but they mean something very different. The difference back in the HIV days was people didn't necessarily know what the endpoint was at that time, but everyone knew that we had to fight to get there. So we have like the inverse situation. So it's kind of a bit echoing Preeti in a less sort of elegant manner, which is just saying we have to examine culturally what it is we want, what assumptions we have, and really we have to look at ourselves in the mirror and say what trade-offs we're willing to make that ultimately put some people's lives at risks in order to stand up systems that don't work for everyone.
So we have some really great questions in the chat. This first one, the question is, Indonesia is currently embarking on efforts to accelerate development and production of its own COVID vaccines to reduce reliance on imported vaccines. How do each of you view this? As I mentioned, Africa is undertaking efforts to be less self-reliant. They want to produce some 60% of vaccines for the African continent by 2040. India, of course, has a Serum Institute, as well as other manufacturing capacity. Maybe I'll start with you, Fiona. What do you think of the Indonesian effort here?
Well, Indonesia is pulling off something that if any other country could pull off would be the best thing that would happen to us. There's nothing as good as self-reliance. I was saying in Africa right now, it's very, very sad to see some of our health workers not vaccinated, to have 7 countries that have not seen a single dose, not a donation dose, not a dose they could buy, not a dose from COVAX facility, not a single dose, and they still do have the virus circulating in their countries. So Indonesia coming up with this is something that all countries should be hoping for. If this is one thing that Africa could come together and do, this would be great. So really, we congratulate Indonesia, and we hope that many of us, the low-income countries, can be able to reach this level. Indonesia, the leadership and political will is very high. Indonesia was one of the first countries to vaccinate and reach very high level of coverage with the COVID-19 vaccine. The president was moving from vaccination site to vaccination site. So that is the level at which our leaders should be working and increase this commitment and make sure that we can see this commitment and of course commit funds to be able to, not funds for the military and all that we invest in. Over.
Preeti, is this what we should, or all the countries around the world should be aiming for, is really self-sufficiency in terms of manufacturing vaccines, as well as perhaps even other pharmaceuticals?
I mean, I would say that's a question for the countries, but over the last 15 years, I've had the privilege of working with civil society groups in many of the emerging markets or middle-income countries who are working closely with their health ministries, their patent offices, and their generics industries. Countries like Argentina, Brazil, Thailand, Ukraine, Morocco, Egypt. I'm sure I'm missing some, but there are many countries that have strong domestic manufacturing capacity already, that have been, where their governments have been proactive, have been willing to make those investments, to think about the policies that are necessary to support their industries to flourish, that are constantly managing that balance of getting pushback from the multinational pharmaceutical industry, and even from the US and Europe through IP sort of lobbies and even through the international institutions themselves. It's been a balancing act. I think it's been very difficult, but we have examples like the Thai GPO, like many independent manufacturers in India. There are amazing manufacturers in Argentina and in other countries. And so I don't think this is a new conversation about autonomy and self-sufficiency. I think countries have long recognized that there is that need. I think in a moment like this, where the United States was by far the largest investor for the R&D, the power dynamics shift, because the first vaccines now to come onto the market that have this level of effectiveness are coming out of the United States. And that's why we focus so much on, well, who really funded these inventions? The taxpayers did. And that's where, if we're thinking about global equity, that's why we as individuals, I really believe, have so much power to influence our government to support this move towards self-reliance.
So this next question really dovetails with your comments here, Preeti. Rohit, how can we ensure that we support a more just and global response for future pandemics? Are there specific ways American citizens can be lobbying or working toward this? I think the 070 patent on the spike protein stabilization that is being used by Moderna, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson is one example of this kind of policy leverage that US could be invoking here and that citizens could be advocating for. But what is your response for that?
Yeah, so I think there is both in the near term, there is, for instance, not just the prefusion spike protein, but actually a number of the different technology components in the Moderna vaccine that were funded by the NIH or by the public sector. So actually the US government's leverage over this vaccine in the near term is quite substantial and could be used to both expand production capacity in the United States, but again, to Preeti's point, to really look at how you expand production of this vaccine globally. Of course, that what's pushing back against that is this idea that mRNA technology is going to be the basis of many different therapeutic areas in the future. And as we saw, I think last week in the newspapers, the pharmaceutical industry claiming you're going to hand this technology to China and Russia and therefore undermine our national security and our own interests. In the longer term, even as other countries are going to expand their investment in research and development and scientific capacity, the United States is going to continue to be one of the major funders of research and development through the National Institutes of Health. We heard in the speech last night from the president about creating a new health agency, for instance, that would complement the work of the NIH and BARDA. So there's always going to be more opportunities to demand that the technologies that are funded by the public sector are provided on terms that can be used more broadly in more countries as they are in development, and not just to simply hand them over to pharmaceutical companies to commercialize and to only make available to a limited number of people, both in terms of pricing and registration, and also just ensuring that they work in a wider set of populations. But it's broader than that. The United States will continue to have a certain amount of power within the global R&D system and in the global governance system. And with that power, they have to decide to exercise restraints. They have to find a way of working collectively with other countries and to cede some of that power to create an outcome that is not only more equitable and more just, but it's ultimately more safe and more responsible for Americans. So that really just lies in the ability of the United States to take a step back and put a different priority forward in terms of what they negotiate with. And some of that ultimately comes from Americans also demanding that of their government when they are thinking through how we build back better in the future.
So I just have one last question for all of you, and then I'll turn it back over to Basola to wrap. And if we could keep your comments short, maybe a minute. There's one major corporate sector that we've barely touched on in our conversation. Fiona very briefly mentioned this in her comments, which is the tech industry, social media industry. And as she noted, disinformation, misinformation is being exported from the global north to the global south and is very much feeding into poor vaccine confidence, conspiracy theories around the vaccines. What is our responsibility here? How might we be held liable, or that industry be held liable for what they are actively doing to reduce vaccine uptake in other parts of the world? Maybe if we could start with Fiona.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So as WHO, we've put out in the African region in particular, because we are basically the most affected with this. You don't have the vaccine, but even with a little you have high levels of hesitancy. So the WHO has started an alliance for infodemic debunking, which we are calling the Infodemic Alliance for in Africa. And we are having a number of partners that are in it, Africa, CDC, UNICEF, and everybody. And what we do is, much as we get the viral fake news, we also have viral facts. We are pushing out as many facts as possible and making it viral through the same media that are being used, the same forums that are being used to send the fake news. But also we are having credible people. If you realize, we had almost 90% of our heads of state being at the launches and being the first people to be vaccinated. That is not coming by coincidence. This is a lot of work that is being put in to increase the vaccine confidence. At individual levels, we need to just say the truth. We know anti-vaxxer groups are there; they are highly funded, but let them not affect even what we already have as a really negative start of the global shortage of the vaccine. Individual level, we all have that moral authority to put out the right information to the right people so that people get their doses. Over.
Preeti, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's very interesting because in the United States, there's a growing movement led by organizers of color around issues of anti-monopoly. So companies like Amazon and Facebook are definitely top of the list. I think what's so interesting here in the States in this moment is how there's growing understanding of how this corporate concentration is actually affecting the pandemic. There are a lot of concerns here about Amazon is entering into the space of delivering medicines to people, for example. And there are a lot of concerns around the conversations that are happening, like, wouldn't our vaccine rollout have gone better domestically if Amazon had just taken care of it? And so I feel heartened that this administration seems to have a more nuanced and a bolder vision for competition policy than we've seen in the past. I feel really good about the people who are being named to these bodies, like the Federal Trade Commission here in the United States, the Consumer Protection Bureau. It's really heartening to see us moving in a new direction where we understand, at least domestically, that the ways in which we've organized our economy, the ways in which we have handed over either a lot of money or a lot of power to private companies has to now be brought back into balance. And I really would just urge and hope that if people are going to engage in advocacy on these issues here, that we would be focusing on, well, how do we apply a global lens to these conversations?
And finally, Rohit, 1 minute for you before we close.
Very quickly, I think what has occurred with misinformation, not only in our politics, but in the pandemic, is a warning. Because what we are seeing now is the increased convergence of the tech industry and the pharmaceutical industry in the drug development space. So the use of artificial intelligence and the collection of large amounts of data to basically optimize every part of the drug development cycle. And this is moving in a direction in which people talk about it sort of improving the drug discovery and optimizing it, but it's actually going to increase the amount of power that both drug companies and tech companies have within the healthcare space, and further focus drug research and development on a tinier and tinier portion of the population as we personalize products. So the concern I have is, as the power of these industries grow, and as drug companies become much more like tech companies, we're simply going to see the same sort of this lack of awareness, this lack of understanding, and really this walling off of most of the world from the benefits of technology and development, and actually moving us in a much more dangerous direction.
Well, and of course, personalizing technology and pharmaceuticals for the greatest profit, right? For those who can pay the most. Really fascinating conversation. Really appreciate that. I'll turn it back over to Bisola.
Thank you so much, Celine. To close, I'd like to thank Fiona, Preeti, Rohit, and Celine for such a thoughtful and insightful conversation. I think you've highlighted the dysfunctional global response to the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly in regards to vaccines. But more importantly, you've been very insightful about describing the critical challenges to addressing these issues and what it is we really need to do in regards to future pandemics, as well as right now. I think we have a lot of work to do, and I commend all the work that you all have done thus far. So thank you to our listeners for joining us today. If you would like to catch up on any of the prior Global Vaccine Equity webinar discussions, you may access the recordings on the Harvard Global Health Institute's website. Have a wonderful afternoon or evening. Bye.